My name is Chris Eaton, and I'm the author of Chris Eaton, a Biography. The genesis of the book is kind of a lucky coincidence, which is nice because that's a lot about what the book is about, and maybe that's what the book is about. That makes sense. When I published my first novel, I was being confused a lot on Amazon, but for another Chris Eaton who also wrote books. In fact, I think there were 4 Chris Eatons who had things on Amazon at the time. One was a book of short stories, one was a novelist, but they were all out of print. And then there was this other man who was writing stuff on how to do short-term missionary work, which is the one I was being confused for. And I don't know, I kind of found his life fascinating, and that people who would know either one of us we were being linked. We were being made one person by the internet, basically, and there's no reason for anyone to not think we were the same person. I'd also been confused years before, probably 10 years before I started the book, for the Christian rock singer. And not like wildly confused, but confused by my friends who, people I had just met, but I had moved to Toronto, and I was playing, I'd played in a band for a few years, so I'd just come to Toronto, I started playing under my own name. And suddenly there was a big ad in the local weekly that was, Chris Eaton live in Nathan Phillips Square or Mel Lastman Square, or some big open area concert in the middle of Toronto. The headliner was Chris Eaton, which I still think is kind of weird. I'm surprised. I'm kind of shocked at how big he is, but he's won Grammys and stuff, and I think in the Christian rock circles he's quite a big deal. But my friends were all like, oh, because I think probably in the same weekly there was probably an ad of, this band with this opener, and Chris Eaton at the Spadina Hotel or something, right? So I just got really, I think I had a slow day at work one day, and I said, as a lot of people do, Googled my name, and I had, luckily it was, it was probably like early Google. It produced, I think, 400,000 pages, so I read them all and took a lot of notes about all of their lives. And in my head, I don't want to say against my will, but I was starting to make those connections anyway. I was trying to figure out which of those people were the same people, and even when they weren't, and you knew for sure that they weren't, how interesting it was that the same dates came up or the same locations came up. And so I started writing stories about them and trying to, I don't know if exaggerate is the right word, but accentuate those connections. And then it blossomed into the book. I feel like so much of our lives and how we create the story of our own lives in our head is built on a lot of coincidence, that there's not necessarily linear connections to, from, how long your labor lasted to when you said your first word to, how well you did in junior high school and the people you dated in high school and all, like that we kind of make this thing that's like, this is what's led me to this point. Whereas I kind of think a lot of that's coincidental, so in creating the book, I wanted to show how you could take different events from different other people's lives and connect them in that way, just through coincidence. And sometimes a lot of the events in the book take, place names will come up, or dates or numbers or something like that, or just things that will happen to them that are similar. But the key to it all was to have everyone have the same name, so that line would be blurred for the the experiencer, the reader. What's great about a work of art, sort of a painting, is that it doesn't tell you a story, it evokes a story. And often you'll look at art and it'll make you think about other pieces of art. It'll make you think about parts of your life that you remember. It might make you think about stories that other people have told you. And that's what I want to do, is try to have that interaction with a reader, that they read the book, they hopefully are excited by the craftsmanship of it, but also that these little bits of life that I've put in, that those things will make the reader live it on their own instead of me describing it. The other soldier asked him if he liked music. Chris Eaton said he did. The other soldier asked what kind, and Chris Eaton said all kinds. Was there not one kind in particular, asked the other soldier. And Chris Eaton said no, there was not. What about country, asked the other soldier. What about rock? What about Christian music? Him, he liked only one band. That was how particular his taste was, and probably, when it came right down to it, just one album. It was his album, he said. It was the album he'd probably been searching for most of his life and didn't even know it. And when he finally found it, nothing else he listened to felt complete. It was the album that finally made him feel calm. It was the album, he felt, that might have saved his marriage if he'd found it sooner, that might have saved the relationship with his kids. It was the album that might have made him happy. Chris Eaton reconfirmed that he liked all kinds of music, that he found them all interesting and appealing for a variety of reasons, and that he tried whenever he could to venture outside of his normal comfort zone to seek out new auditory experiences. The other soldier suggested Chris Eaton had just not found the right one yet. The other soldier asked him if he'd killed anyone yet. The other soldier said the only worse thing than lobsters on your piano was crabs on your organ. The other soldier said that he once read an article in a magazine written by a man, he said, or maybe a woman, from a part of the country where you wouldn't expect, where they don't normally have those kinds of people. People who don't have anything to do with their hands. People who think too much. Not in some place like New York or Massachusetts or Rhode Island or California. No, this person was from somewhere in the middle. And this was where he'd first come across the idea that each person had one album that was their musical soulmate. The premise, he said, was really just an expansion on the idea of desert island discs. A radio program started in Britain shortly after the outbreak of World War II. The American critic from the magazine he'd read had taken this premise one step further, suggesting people might be happier even, with just one, because this would remove the stress of having to choose between those 8 every day. And the critic used, as an example, the life of someone the soldier was unfamiliar with, someone he had meant to look up, but as of yet had not. In fact, he'd all but forgotten his name. Because the most interesting thing about this person, this happiest man, was not his name, but how he had started his own musical journey through life, and how it seemed to mirror the other soldier's life so precisely. Listening to his parents' old jazz records on the wrong speed, thinking music was a plodding thing, heavy and thick, like gobs of batter falling from a spoon. Being introduced to the music of Charlie Haddon, which broke everything wide open, obviously owing a nod to Elvis, but without the King's fattening showmanship. Purchasing every Haddon record he could find, from what he thought was Haddon's self-titled debut to the third album, The Grey Fog, even after the singer-guitarist died so prematurely and they continued to release greatest hits packages with smatterings of unreleased studio recordings for the next 10 years. This led to his discovery of the British invasion, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones through an honest, hopeful mistake, a record by a band called the Haddons, who had no real connection to Charlie and were not particularly good. The other man went to Vietnam, too, and opened a music store, and the soldier began to believe that the article had actually been written about him specifically. He thought it was a sign, and he began weeding down his own collection as if by a message from God, immediately tossing any record he had not listened to in the last 5 years, then 1 year, then 6 months, then writing down very selective criteria that had to be met by the remaining 100 or so records to stay on his shelf. It had to be influential in some way, and couldn't be simple to classify as a genre, and had to be somewhat obscure because he didn't want his special disc to also be someone else's, without being entirely pompous. And then he basically just decided to remove the half dozen classical records because how could they really speak to him when they weren't from his generation, and anything with a saxophone or a banjo, until one day he was down to his traditional 8 Desert Island discs, which he set up head-to-head in a tournament bracket until he had one winner. And finally, he was left with only Charlie Harden and Chip Shorter, played for old time's sake on the wrong speed, and he chose Chip Shorter. And he found that the result was the opposite, that he was hungrier for new music than he'd ever been in his life. And the next day he heard the music that was the last CD he'd ever buy, the CD he was currently listening to, and he'd never listened to another record again. "We're all searching for something," the other soldier said. "I'm just lucky enough to have found it." "That's idiotic," Chris Eaton said, and shut his eyes to go to sleep. And the next day he was dead.